Okay, this session is going to be a continuation of the last session. There's just so much material to talk about when we're talking about forgiveness that I'm going to spend another session talking about some more details regarding that. One of the things that carries over from the last session that I just want to comment on is an implication that we need to get clear. And I'm going to disagree with some popular notions about forgiveness, and that is that once it's forgiven, you should never bring it up again. And I don't think that that's quite accurate. In other words, biblically speaking, there's a difference doctrinally between justification and sanctification. You know, these are fancy words, but in justification, what God does is He legally pardons me from all the sins that I've done against Him, okay? And I'm released from that debt. It's what Christ did on the cross. And so when Christ died and rose again, it was the sign and seal of my justification, which meant God took all my sins, paid for them at one time, and now He's done with that. But in sanctification, He's asking me now to live in such a way that reflects my gratitude for what He's done for me as I try to live a holy life. But the fact is, I still sin. And so He wants to talk to me about my ongoing sin. So this idea that once it's forgiven, you never talk about it again, I don't think that that actually is quite right, because God talks to me about my sin after it's been forgiven. The difference is, once it's forgiven, it changes the tone or it changes the tenor of how He talks to me about it. He doesn't talk to me in threatening ways. He doesn't talk to me in a judgmental fashion about it. He doesn't hold it over my head. He comes to me with forbearance. He comes to me in mercy. He comes to me with patience. And the way He can do that is because He's forgiven it. But He's still talking to me about it. So I just want to tweak that idea a little bit, that once it's forgiven, you should no longer talk about it. I don't think that's quite right. What you find out is, when you do talk about it, the tone will indicate if it's really forgiven or not. So when it comes back up, and now it actually is all of this, you start to use it as a weapon, in other words. Once you start talking about it that way, then I would say, you know what, it probably isn't forgiven, and you need to back up a little bit. But if you can bring it up, and now we can actually talk about it because we're broken over our sin, I think that's a good indicator that it actually has been forgiven and you're still working at it. So let's talk. I need to know some more details about that sin, so by God's grace I can do a better job of repenting of it. Now let me go on to something else here about forgiveness that I think is important. And I think that there are two steps in forgiveness that we need to know about. And I'm going to get this idea out of Mark 11:25. And in that passage, it says, "And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven might forgive you your sins." Now there's nothing in that passage, there's nothing in that whole paragraph that talks about having a confrontation between you and the offender. This is done in an act of prayer, but it involves another individual, someone who's hurt you. Now I think it works like this. Step one is Mark 11:25. It's where you're going to actually free your conscience. You're creating an attitude in your heart toward the offender that may or may not ever get worked out in step two. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But getting yourself ready for step two is what you have to do. Okay, so in step one, based on Mark 11:25, it's between you and the Lord, and it's in prayer. And I think that context is helpful, because what do we do many times in prayer? Well, we're confessing our own sins to God. And as we do that, He conveys to me His forgiving grace. So now as I'm getting my own heart rich in grace again, I'm developing an attitude in which I can now, before the Lord, forgive the offender, but it's in private. It's in an act of prayer, but it regards a third party. Now you've got to do that. And that gets you ready for step two. But step two may not happen for various reasons. Let's say you're an adult now, you're a mother, you're a wife, and as you're growing into adulthood, your life is still tormented because when you were much younger and as a child, your father molested you many nights for many weeks over a period of many years. Well, you don't just get over something as traumatic or hurtful as that. So now you end up in the counseling office and you're trying to get some help with this. And now we get to this stage and we say, well, you know what, I believe that at some point you're going to have to forgive your father. And the individual says, well, but that's not going to happen. He died 15 years ago and he's 6 feet under. Say, well, I understand. I'm not saying you've got to have a confrontation. I'm saying that what was done to you, it's still alive in your heart. I mean, you're talking like it was yesterday. And I understand that. But what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go through Mark 11:25, and you're going to have to release it. So if we had a good one-word definition for forgive, basically, biblically, it means to release it. So I'm going to pay the debt myself, and then in my heart, in an attitude of forgiveness, I'm going to let that person go. That's Mark 11:25, and that's level 1 forgiveness. Now what that does then is it prepares you for level 2. And this is where there's actually a transaction now between you and the offender. Okay, but you've done the heart work now and you're ready. So let's say, for example, and this really did happen, it was a Wednesday evening and I had a meeting to go to at the church that I attend. And probably 30 minutes before I had to leave the meeting, I said or did something, I actually don't even remember the details right now, but hurt my wife. And so for 30 minutes leading up to when I needed to go, all I could get out of my mouth was, I'm sorry. Honey, I'm sorry. Baby, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. But it was pathetic, honestly. I mean, the pride wouldn't let me get beyond saying I'm sorry. And I'm sorry doesn't change anything. Okay, so if somebody stabbed you in the chest and you're bleeding, and they're over there just saying, I'm sorry, man, I am so sorry. But what about the knife and the blood that's coming out? I mean, you've got to have a transaction where you actually help pull the knife out and to begin to provide some healing. Okay? So I'm sorry is not changing anything. You can say it, but you've got to go way beyond that. So now I go off to, I'm like, I got to go. So I left for the meeting, do the 2 or 3 hour meeting, come back home, and she's sitting on the couch reading a book. So I'm hoping to myself, maybe she's over it, which again, I know that's not true, but I'm just hoping because I don't want to have another conflict, okay? So I go in the kitchen, get something to drink, come in, sit on the opposing couch, pick up a book, I start reading, but I'm really not reading. I'm just hoping she's over it. Well, we're not 2, 3, 5 minutes into this, where we're sitting in silence, that she puts her book down, sets it on the floor, looks at me and says, isn't there something you want to ask me? Okay, now it was totally disarming. So I started laughing. I put my book down. I said, honey, there is something I need to ask you. And then I went through it, and what I need to know from you is, would you please forgive me? Well, I could barely get the word or the question out of my mouth, and she's like, well, sure, I'll forgive you. I mean, it happened like that. Now, it happened so quickly that I actually know what she did. And when I was gone at that meeting, she did step 1. She paid for it while I was gone. She got herself ready, so then when we got ready for level 2, and now we actually are doing this transaction, and I come to ask the question, bam, yeah, well sure I'll forgive you, because in her heart she had already released it. So there's private work and there's public work. You've got to always do the private work. It may or may not lead to the public work, depending on, is that individual even alive? Do they even want to participate? Right? Sometimes if it's at a work situation, you've got employees or employers, and this is not their language. They don't function on this level of thinking, and so it's not going to level 2 isn't going to happen. But you've at least for yourself got to get level 1 down. Now let me finish with one other quick thought, and it's a very common notion, and that is that you've got to at some point learn how to forgive yourself. And I want to say I hear that frequently in my office. I'll read it in Christian literature, and it's not biblical. There's no place in the Bible where God says you must learn to forgive yourself. I think it's a notion that comes from the unbelieving world who has no God to forgive them. They know they're guilty, but they don't have a God to forgive them. So what have they done? I mean, they're left with themselves. And now not only are they guilty, but they've got to find a way to forgive themselves. It doesn't even work. So unfortunately, I think Christians not discerning have bought into that notion that we've got to somehow forgive ourselves. Well, what you're saying in essence as a Christian is that God's forgiveness must not therefore be enough for you. And I don't think we want to say that. It means that I've got to grow in my understanding or my valuing of how rich God's forgiveness is to me, and that it's greater than I'll ever comprehend. You're in no position to forgive yourself, and you don't have to. God has done it for you.